Welcome back. Today we're going to do a quick chat on the TempoTec March 5. So this one I believe is available right now and is actually shipping. So this is the Bluetooth version, and I think it's just under $200. They have, I think, a non-Bluetooth version, which is slightly cheaper. There was a limited version, which was a little bit nicer and has a little bit more power, and that was more expensive. But this is I would say it's the general one that people are going to pick up because it has Bluetooth included, which is a handy feature for most people. But normally I would plug it in and kind of rotate the volume, and it has a display here and you can see the volume change, and that's kind of interesting to see. But I would say the display it's very functional, it's very minimal, tells you the volume and the bit rate and which output is selected. And that's pretty handy. I didn't necessarily use the display or look at it all that much. The remote essentially does the same things. Mode, gain, and output are essentially handled by these three buttons here, and they're reflected in the display. On the front, you also do get a 1/4 inch. You do get a single-ended and a 4.4 balanced here. If we flip it around the back, it does have some nice features on the back, and kind of also what you would expect. So this one does have XLR out, which is actually handy. It does do RCA single-ended out as well. On the inputs, it does do coax, optical, Bluetooth, and USB, as you would expect. So again, when I talked about the FIO $1,000 FIO K17, I think that was the name of it, that was a box that had a million features. It had a ton of things that you would probably never use in the course of your daily listening habits, but it was there just in case. And if you were willing to pay for it, that box did seem like everything. This is what I would say the more traditional DAC amp style is. It is very focused on sound quality and implementation of a core feature set done very, very well. And I would actually say the same thing about their Blaze. People will complain, well, it should have Android and should have a million other features, but the implementation of the DAC, the amp, the outputs, the power, the Hibby link, the 8-ball EQ, they hit the core feature set that they needed to and offered it at a price that was very, very attractive. And I think it actually lower price since I reviewed it. This, I would say, the March 5 is almost the same thing. It's very much a sound quality focused, great implementation of these inputs and the Class A amp and the XLR out. It's just a very focused on the core feature set as opposed to giving you a ton of features that you're probably never going to use. So I can appreciate TempoTec's approach here on both of these products. I think they approach them in the same way. Give people what they want, what's really important to the majority of people, and keep the price attractive so you don't have this, almost a feature bloat that causes a price bloat, and then you're essentially offering a so-so amp with a ton of features that is now priced out of the range of most people. So what do we have going on inside of the March 5? We've got a dual AK4493 SEQ, which was similar to this same exact 4493 SEQs. This one has a Class A amp. This one does not have a Class A amp. This one was single-ended at 425 milliwatts. The balance is about 1750 milliwatts. I think this was 825, so this one kind of fits in the middle of both of those. This one does do USB in up to DSD 512 MQA. Bluetooth does support SBC, AAC, and LDAC. Coax in, optical in, and they said the optical in caps out at 96 kilohertz, which is actually not true. It works at 192. It also does support 176, which is the oddball bit rate that a lot of things don't support. They tend to jump from 96 to 192, and 176 tends to not work or kind of be a little bit noisy. This one actually supports both, which was kind of interesting, and I'm not sure why they picked 96, but I tend to use it at 192. And as I said, it does do RCA single-ended out, and it does XLR balanced out as well. So is this a desktop version of this, right? Are these two essentially sound the same? This one does have a different amplifier, so I think it does sound a little bit different than this one. And when I talked about the Blaze, I said this one is really the imager. It was tuned to promote really sharp imaging, almost a technical show off is I think technical show off. It had a very clean sound and it had faster, lighter bass. The M5, it's also what I would say it's a weightier version of this sound But it still has great imaging as well, which is kind of what I would expect from TempoTec. But the low end is closer to what I expected to hear. And I think when I heard these two side by side, I had actually started out with the Blaze, and I'm like, hey, this is kind of interesting, and it has kind of a imaging lean to it. And then when you hear the M5, like, well, this is exactly what I thought this was going to sound like. This is sort of more balanced from, low end through the high end, and it has more of a what I would have expected to hear from an AK style Velvet Sound amp. This is kind of hit exactly that. Whereas this one was kind of a really interesting lean on it. And as I said, I probably say it there, right? So when I heard the M5, that was part of the motivation for doing the MSEB tweaks to this one, right? If you make this a little bit weightier, add a little bit of weight to the low end with that EQ on MSEB, that is a global setting, you can actually bring it a little bit closer to here, and you kind of close the gap to it. So I thought that was half of the motivation for this was, well, this should maybe have sounded like this one, but I can appreciate what they did with this as well, and thought that I don't have any problem with what they did there. They gave you a way to adjust it with fine detail and tunings with MSEB. You could actually move it any way you want. This one is pretty much set up, I think, quite well for a very, very balanced sound. So I do think both are great products. I think Blaze has MSEB. This one has XLR outs, so you could actually use it as a DAC. It's just odd to see a brand release two products almost simultaneously that are very, very nicely executed, offered at a great price. There's nothing really wrong with either one of them. They're both great products, just aiming at two different people. But kind of surprising to see them nail both products is how I will say it. So in general, kind of at a top level, where does the March 5 kind of fit in with other popular style DAC or DAC amps? And I would say if you're into the Measure Kings, like I have SMSL and I have Topping, those are almost flat reference, very extended style DAC amps. This one doesn't quite extend as well. It's not quite as clean or as reference as those. At the same time, is it like a FIO? FIO has that clinical sound to it. It is not like that either. And then at the other end, you sort of have the IFIs and almost the X Duos, the brands that tend to add a little bit more warmth, a little bit more low end, tend to roll off the upper end, so you get this nice, warm, comforting, smooth sound. It's not even that. I think it's almost right in the middle of the IFIs and the Toppings. It's this nice balance of not being overly analytical or flat as a Topping, but not going as warmed over or as smoothed over as an IFI or some of the other brands that do kind of a heavy warmth component to it. This one is kind of right in the middle, and I think that does give you a really nice balance. And what it really does is it gives you a little bit of warmth over a set like a Topping, but it still sounds resolving, and it will still make your set sound quite great without having that overly smoothed over loss of technical sound to it that some of the other sets do. So just in a few words, how does it sound different than Blaze? The weight and the bass presence sound more natural. And again, it's sort of what I noticed on this one. It kind of right out of the bat, it sounds a little bit light on the bass, whether that was sped up or just a lower bass presence. But that promoted the more analytical sound, the more technical sound that you're going to get on Blaze. Whereas this one is sort of exactly where you kind of have that more natural weightiness to the mids. It will give them more dimension from the Class A and instruments and stage. I think it just kind of all around fixed a couple nitpicks that I had on this that I would have fixed in MSEB. This is sort of where they are and where they should have been for my expectations. So does M5 sacrifice the text or the imaging for weight and warmth? And kind of what I was just talking about. Not really. I think neither Blaze nor M5 are really overly warmed or smoothed over or lacking text in any way. They just do it. They just handle it a little bit differently than an IFI does or an X Duo does. So, and I'll kind of get to that a little bit later, how they do it. But again, I mentioned it a little bit on this one, and we'll kind of talk about it on here. But I think it is a really better middle ground between the analytical style DAC amps that you may be looking at and the ones that are a little bit too warm, not really resolving enough. So in general, do I like it? Yes. I don't like amps that color too much, that add too much emphasis, or otherwise deviate too far from neutral. And in this case, I think they, like I said, it's pretty much the middle ground. I wouldn't say it's flat neutral, but close enough. And they didn't lose the resolve, and it still sounds technical enough. They kind of nailed that middle ground really well. In the case of AK DACs and Class A amps, you should really get the resolve with the textures and refined analog edges, right? So AKMs, AK DACs, they're really good. They're kind of, if you think about ESS being sharper and more analytical, think about AKs as taking some of that sharp edge and that analytical bit and feathering the edge so it sounds a little bit more refined, a little bit more analog is how I'd say. And that's sort of what should come across to most people who buy March 5. You can kind of hear that right away. The Class A also helps as well. So on the Class A, what does that really sound like? I always think about it almost like a silent room with depth, but fully resolved. And it's not dark and rolled off, but Class A have this weird sensation of being in the room, of being in a really dark, quiet room, and there's a person playing, and you get that person almost has a presence in the stage at an actual location. Like when people talk about DAC and amps or even IMs sounding one note or very flat, Class A is sort of the opposite of all that. It really gives you a sense of presence for an instrument and its location in a room. And it may not be the biggest, swirling around your head soundstage. I don't think Class A is necessarily for that, but as far as presenting a sense of space in a room with a location, with a almost a physical presence, I think Class A's are actually quite good at that. And again, I would say it's mids that should have some dimension to them. They should have texture. They should be analog enough to almost trick your brain into thinking that person is playing there about 5 feet from you. But that's sort of the magic of Class A. When it's done really right, you have to think about it. It's like, is this close enough to someone playing in front of me, as opposed to hearing it from a speaker or a non-resolving speaker, where it simply just sounds like playback, and you're standing in front of it, and your brain never says, well, that's not a speaker, that's an actual person. It never really tricks your brain in that way. And then you get some of the nicer DAC amps, and it really takes you there, where your brain's kind of going back and forth. Is that person really there, or am I just hearing a playback? So again, TempoTecs, I think both of these things are really, really good at creating space, and I think AKs are also good at creating space. I think they call it immersion, but I would call it creating space. It's not quite the swirling around your head of a virtual soundstage kind of thing. It's more about depth and dimension. But I would also say that rule number one on DAC amps for me is, does it make my IAM shine? Does it bring something different that sounds better? And M5, I would say absolutely it does. And I would say when people say IAM scale with amps, and I say that quite often, does it happen with this one? Absolutely. And just kind of an example. So going back to when I reviewed Zenith, KZ Zenith, I said there's going to be some people who pop Zenith on their phone or pop it on a dongle, and they'll say, well, there's really minimal difference between that and KZ's EDC Pro. They're both tuned very similarly. On a normal dongle, like a $5 dongle, it's going to be quite hard to figure out what is different. And then when you listen to it on March 5, it's a different set. And you can call that scaling, call it whatever, but on M5, it's really, really hard to figure out that you're listening to Zenith. It could be almost any brand of high-quality dynamic driver set. It has no KZ-ness to it at all. It just sounds like a very, very high-quality, very resolving single dynamic driver. So yeah, I think absolutely this one has the capability to make most of your sets that you have on your desk probably sound better than how you're listening to them. Does it sound better than Blaze 3? I think, yeah, in most cases, it probably sounds a little bit better than Blaze 3, unless you use MSEB, then you can kind of close the gap. But I think in general, the Class A amp, I think actually does add a sense of depth and dimension that you don't quite get on Blaze, but very, very close. But, I will say this one passes rule number one, and that's why I continue to use March 5. Sometimes I get an amp in, I'm like, it sounds okay, but I'm not really going to use it all that often. March 5 connected to my Gremlin. I sort of went back and forth with these quite a lot, and I never really stopped using March 5 even on its own. I think it's actually a really, really nice amp. I mean, I think a lot of it is it's not the same as my toppings or my SMSLs either. It still sounds as resolving, but it's a little bit different, and I find that attractive and kind of kept me going back to it. So is it perfect? And I'll say no. I have a few nitpicks with it. I think the XLR out should be line out, not power out. If you actually turn on the XLRs in the back, they're actually controlled with the volume, so you have to max out the volume or turn the volume up quite high, and then your XLRs sort of approximate what line out would be. But if you're going to call it line out balance, then it should be line out and just max out the volume for people. That would be a lot easier than the next day coming back and forgetting that the volume is maxed, and you plug something in and you're like, well, I hear nothing. It's like, oh, I have to switch the output back to this, and then you forget that the volume was maxed out, and that's just something that I don't really like to deal with because it happens to me quite often. But I think simultaneous outputs would have been pretty good. Some amps do like all balanced out, or sometimes they have the single-ended or enabled at the same time that the balancer out. Not always. It's kind of harder to find those things, but if I could find an amp that has both the single-ended and the 4.4 working or outputting at the same time simultaneously, I think that's always a bonus. Doesn't happen here, and here you have to discreetly check, you have to discreetly enable the output. So just kind of a small nitpick there. And I think what they did really, really well on Blaze was that menu is like super deep. There's got a ton of different options. It even has like the DAC filters. Like I said, it had the soundstage, it has MSEB. There's a ton of things that you can actually change on Blaze. On M5, you don't really have that many settings. It's quite limited until they come out with and again, you're kind of limited to what you can do here, but perhaps they'll come out with a firmware update that does a couple of new things. But as of now, you don't have all the settings that you get on this. So if you actually use this one as a DAC, you do have essentially access to all of those settings, which is actually pretty cool. So it's like having an AK DAC with all those settings, whereas this one is pretty much hard-coded to some defaults, which definitely sound good. But I think TempoTec seems to be really good at making music occupy the space. Like I said, this implementation and the depth that you get out of it is actually quite good. And I would call it more of a natural stage size, and you hear that in reviews. Right, there's some IEMs tend to have really big sound stages, and then some of them people say, well, this presents a stage as I was naturally expected. And I think TempoTec is actually really, really good at that style sound presentation. Something to their low pass filter and achieving a presentation that is their preference, right? Both of these essentially do, I think, the same thing with the low pass filter. They would call it filtering out the higher end frequency noise, and I think that is true. But the way it attenuates the upper end and it doesn't quite extend as far as a topping does is a little bit different. And they don't necessarily lower the treble. I think they tend to attenuate it in a way that carries it out a little bit further than some of the warmer sets like the IFIs and the X Duos. This will sound more extended than those, not quite the topping level. But how they implement this low pass filter is actually quite interesting to me. And when I heard it on both sets, I sort of figured out kind of what was going on. And there'll be some sets that maybe don't sound as perfect. Like I was listening to Lesureur's S12 2024, a very, very extended planar style IEM, very extended. It doesn't actually have a whole lot of high frequency noise. It doesn't really need any low pass filter or noise attenuation because it's actually quite controlled all the way out there. But you sort of notice that's the part that's not quite there on March 5, but a set like Zenith, it's actually almost perfect. This is going to help probably more sets it's going to hurt. But on a set like S12 2024, I kind of say there, that's exactly why you want a DAC amp that has XLR out, because you can plug it into another amp. I have a few other amps, and I can just run those. I have a Gremlin that usually sits on top of this. That will give me a little bit more upper end as well. So, yeah, it is an all-around great little box, and I wouldn't say these nitpicks really matter a whole lot. There's kind of ways around them. If you have both of these, that's kind of a really great combination. It kind of gives you both sides of those as well. You can flip back and forth between use your Blaze as a DAC, and I think that is a very cool thing to do as well. So, Yeah, very cool. Very, very interesting that TempoTec decided to put out two products that were similar yet different, but still really great values, really great sounding boxes. So kind of cheers to them, credit to them. I think they did a really nice job on both of those. So thank you guys again for tuning in, and I will see you next time.